Hi, I'm Laura Nelkin. I'm a knitwear designer. I live in upstate New York in the Finger Lakes, and I'm really excited to share one more technique that I have figured out to do with Stitch Saver. Lola's two-timing technique is going to make your knitting life a little bit easier. Sometimes when we knit, we want to have two layers of fabric. It doesn't happen often, but it does come up every once in a while. Like in Bling Bag, I wanted to have two layers of fabric for the casing. In Newstalgia, I wanted to have two layers of fabric for the ruffles. In my Flip Top Mittens, when you're making the flap, you end up with two layers of knit fabric. And finally, maybe you're working on a sweater with pockets. That pocket can be a second layer of fabric as well. So I want to show you how easy it is to work Lola's two-timing technique, and let's jump right in and do that together. First, I know many of you might know what Stitch Saver is, but for some of you, this might be a new knitting tool. Once you discover Stitch Saver, you are going to love the variety of things that Stitch Saver can do. Stitch Saver is hollow silicone tubing. For this technique, I like to use 2mm hollow silicone tubing. I use Stitch Saver when I'm holding stitches on projects, when I'm doing provisional cast-ons, like for a turned hem or a modular design. When I have an edge that I want to pick up stitches along, I do Lola's pickup line. I've got a bunch of different tutorials and techniques that use Stitch Saver, and I will link to a blog post below that will give you a place to get Stitch Saver if you don't already have any, and then a link to all of those tutorials that I have. So you will need Stitch Saver to work Lola's two-timing technique, but if you don't have any, you can try it over a spare circular needle. Just make sure that you work it tightly so you don't end up with a little gap or loose yarn. So let's jump right in and I'll show you how to do it. Okay, here's the basic concept of working Lola's two-timing technique. You can hold your Stitch Saver to the back of your work and wrap your yarn around it if you want to have a layer at the back of your piece. And you can hold your Stitch Saver to the front when you're working a row, and then that will give you a layer at the front of your piece. So I have a little swatch of stockinette stitch down here, and I'm going to show you how to work both of those techniques. And then I'll show you how that applies to a few projects, because I think it really helps to go a little deeper with the information once you understand how to work this maneuver. So here I am with my little swatch, and I've already worked one stitch. And what I am going to do is hold my Stitch Saver, and I'm going to hold my Stitch Saver over my working yarn and bring that working yarn up over the Stitch Saver. So I'm basically wrapping it around the Stitch Saver. And then I'm going to work a stitch. And then I'm going to bring that yarn underneath the Stitch Saver and then over the Stitch Saver to knit the next piece. And the reason that I am wrapping in this direction is so that those wraps end up oriented so that when you go to knit into them, they will have a little twist, which will tighten things up as you go to work that step. So this is how you work this technique with the Stitch Saver held to the back. But let's say that your pattern wants you to hold the Stitch Saver to the front of your work. I'm just going to bring that Stitch Saver to the front and work one stitch just to make sure that I get this correct. Now what you're going to do is bring your working yarn to the front of your work, wrap it around the Stitch Saver, and then back in between your needles, and then go ahead and knit that next stitch. And then you're going to bring your yarn in between your needles, go around and over that Stitch Saver, and go ahead and work that next stitch. And this technique will give you a flap of fabric at the front of your work. And we'll go over how you'll use this technique in Lola's Flip Top Mittens later on in this video. So you can go ahead and watch this more than once if you need to understand how that wrap works, but let's go ahead and look at what happens once you've worked Lola's two-timing technique and you want to create that second layer of fabric on a little scarf so that you can have a ruffle. Okay. Underneath the camera here, I have a little miniature Newstalgia scarf that I am working on. And you can see that when I got to the point in the pattern where I was switching over to the ruffle, that I worked a row with my stitch saver held to the back, and I worked that with the lace weight yarn for the ruffle. And then I continued on working my ruffle, and I even did a beaded bind off on this. And now it's time for me to work the base layer of the body of the shawl again. So all I'm going to do, and this is super cool, is take my stitch saver, put my needle into the stitch saver right there, and then I can take that needle and carefully slide it along. Now, what you don't want to happen is your stitch saver to pop off the end of your needle right there. So I find when doing this step, it's better to push your needle than pull your stitch saver, because it makes sense that if you pull your stitch saver hard, that you're going to potentially pull that stitch saver off of your needle. So once you get all of those stitches onto your needle right there, you'll go ahead with your working yarn and continue to work in pattern. You'll see as I go to work this first row that I'm working through the front leg of that stitch, and I'm twisting that stitch right there, tightening it up. And I think that's a really important step to make sure that you don't end up with any bags or holes on this row. So you're going to go ahead and work that across just like that. Isn't that easy? It's a great way to make a ruffle with 2 layers of fabric. So now that we have looked at Newstalgia, let's go ahead and look at the casing of Bling Bag, because that'll give you an idea of how to work this technique on a casing. I have a little miniature version of Bling Bag here in DK weight yarn, and you can see that the casing I worked with my stitch saver held to the back of my work, and then I've worked the rounds for the casing as written in the pattern, and then taken those stitches and put them onto a holder. And now the next step in the pattern just has me going back, just like we did with the ruffle, and taking those stitches, or I would really call them wraps, from Lola's two-timing technique, and sliding them onto your needle so that you can work that inside flap of fabric just like we did with the ruffle. So it's the exact same technique that we did. This time you're just working it in the round instead of working it flat. I would say if you are working a casing like this, I like to do the inside layer on one needle size smaller than the outside layer. That's a little design technique right there. And that just makes the casing kind of pull up a little bit more so that you don't end up with a casing that's kind of baggy. Oftentimes, if you're sewing something, the inside layer of something will be just like a 1/4 inch smaller on every size than the outside layer so that it pulls in a little bit and sits beautifully. So that's an example of how you use this technique with a casing in a drawstring bag. You could do that for pants as well, or a skirt. I really want to use this technique with a skirt at some point. I think that that would be really fun. So I think you'll find that if you have a pattern that has a casing, you might be able to implement this technique instead of whatever the designer wrote into your pattern. So the next thing I want to show you is how to work the flap on Flip Top Mittens, because that's a little bit different. You're going to hold your stitch saver to the outside on those. Okay, So Flip Top Mitten, isn't she cute? This is one of my oldest designs. I designed this when I was working for Schaefer Yarn Company, and I know much more now than I knew then. So I found a technique that worked for me where I knit into the front and back of the stitches for creating this flap on the mitten, but it was kind of chunky and it wasn't as easy to write out in a pattern. People got a little bit confused by it, but using Lola's two-timing technique for this flap is absolutely brilliant and works really well. So underneath the camera, you can kind of see how that flap works. You can see that you have the flap that goes around the outside of the mitten and then it folds back, and then you have, sorry, I haven't woven in my end yet because I need to choose a button, and then you have the inside of the fabric on your hand. So I've got a little mini version of the Flip Top mitten here so you can see I'm right at that step where I would be integrating in some stitch saver. So if I just grab some stitch saver right here, the only difference here with those other techniques that I showed you is you're going to want to hold your stitch saver to the front when you are working this flap instead of holding it to the back. So you're going to knit one and then you're going to take your yarn and wrap it. Sorry, just kind of getting myself set up on that first stitch. I think the first stitch is the hardest. Wrap it around that stitch saver and then knit one, and then take your yarn and wrap it around that stitch saver and go ahead like that across for all of the outside flap stitches, and then you will be able to go back and work that flap after you've worked the interior of the mitten. So that is the trick for Flip Top Mittens. Not hard at all. Finally, what I briefly want to talk about is pockets and how you could use Lola's two-timing technique for pockets. Check out Snuggler behind me. Snuggler has a pocket where when I wrote this pattern, this is another one of my older patterns, I think it was on round 15, you would go ahead and kind of mark with stitch markers where the pocket stitches should be picked up, and then you would go back and pick up a stitch in every leg and work the pocket flap after you had worked the body up to this point right here at the top of the pocket. But what you could do is work wraps on round 15 for the front of your pocket, and then go ahead and then just slide those wraps onto a needle when it is time to work your pocket, and then integrate them in with the body of your sweater. Someone brought up, I forget if it was on Instagram or Ravelry, someone brought up that you could do a patch pocket, like if you're picking up stitches for a pocket on a sweater. And yes, you could do that if you're really sure of the placement of your pockets. But if you think that you're going to want to block your sweater to make sure those pockets are exactly where you want them to be, then this technique might not work, because if you work this technique and then the pocket placement isn't where you want it, you're going to end up with a line of stitches that are a little bit bigger from wrapping that working yarn around the stitch saver. So I think it's important to bring up those little points so that you know the decision that you're making when you go ahead and use this technique in a pattern that you're working on. Okay. One thing I've been thinking about is where else could we use Lola's two-timing technique? I know I mentioned using it like at the casing at the top of a skirt. What else was I thinking about? Oh, like a folded hat brim potentially would work, to do a top-down folded hat brim. Also maybe a top-down sweater with a turned hem. I think there would be a great way to integrate it for that, so that you don't have to stitch down the inside of your turned hem if you are like me and you will do anything possible to not have to do any finishing sewing on your knitting. My alter ego Lola thought maybe a lined thong or pair of underwear would work very well. One other person was wondering if we could use it on an afterthought heel on a sock, and that is on my list to try out. And if I figure out how to do that, I'll probably end up making another video to do a deep dive into that. So look for that in the future at some point. Of course, if you have any ideas of how to work this technique, I would absolutely love to hear them. Please do subscribe to my channel, sign up for my mailing list. I love to explore new knitting techniques, or new to me knitting techniques, and share them with you. And if you're subscribed to my channel, you will hear when I have something to share. Thank you so much. Happy knitting!